Well, I'll kick things off. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for tuning in today. I am Claire Chan, Senior Research Analyst at the Georgia Municipal Association, where we serve all 537 municipalities in the state. I, along with Becky Taylor, GMA's Director of Federal Relations and Research, are your primary contacts for all things grants here at GMA. GMA, in partnership with the Georgia Association of Regional Commissions and Heyday Services, are thrilled to kick off the first in a series of 12 webinars offering expert knowledge and assistance to local officials on grant writing and grant administration. My remarks today will be a bit longer to allow for a proper introduction of this series, as well as introduction of our regional commission partner and our two expert presenters. The Grants 101 training series is part of a wider initiative at GMA to help cities attract grant funding to their communities. You are here on this call because you are invested in your city and eager to find out how grant funding will help advance goals related to infrastructure, workforce development, housing, and clean energy. As today's presentation will show, there's no better time than now to take advantage of all the funding that's out there. And GMA believes that every city in Georgia that wants to compete for grants deserves a chance. Before introducing Heyday, I want to introduce one of our key partners, Laura Mathis, and allow you the chance to hear from her. She really needs no introduction at this point, but nonetheless, Laura Mathis was named Executive Director of Middle Georgia Regional Commission in Macon, Georgia in July 2016, after serving as Deputy Director for 5 years and Director of Public Administration for 4 years. Prior to joining the Regional Commission in 2007, Laura was the County Manager for Wilkinson County, Georgia. Laura serves as President of the Georgia Association of Regional Commissions. She holds a Master of Public Administration from the University of Georgia, and in 2007 was named one of Georgia Trend's Top 40 Under 40. We are delighted to have Laura here today, and I wanted to give you a chance to share some remarks. Laura, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Claire. Appreciate that introduction. So Georgia's regional commissions serve every city and county across the state, and we are honored to partner with GMA to provide this training and build our collective capacity across the state to serve the citizens of Georgia and our local governments. So hold on, I'm ready to learn more and excited to learn right along with you. Thank you so much for this chance.
Thank you so much, Laura. GMA's partnership with GARC is a natural and sensible one, given that every city is part of a regional commission and has access to this first line of technical assistance when it comes to grants. GMA could not do this without GARC, and we are grateful for this partnership. Now I am excited to turn it over shortly to the experts. That is your powerhouse duo of Amanda Day and Kimberly Hayes DeMuga, co-founders of Heyday Services, a grant and fundraising training company. Together, Kimberly and Amanda have more than 50 years of grants and fundraising experience, have raised millions of dollars, have trained more than 20,000 grant seekers in the art and science of raising more money to transform communities. Kimberly has an extensive background in working with health and human services and education agencies. Amanda is a former local government grants administrator with a strong background in federal grant funding for first responders, infrastructure, and community outreach. Kimberly and Amanda are also co-hosts of the popular podcast on grants, Fundraising Heyday. Before I turn it over to them, let me cover just a few housekeeping items. Number one, as this is a webinar, please utilize the Q&A function on your Zoom window to pose any questions for Kimberly or Amanda throughout their presentation. Number two, if you register for this webinar, you will receive a follow-up email no later than a week from today with the recording and other materials from today's webinar. And lastly, you will find a brief survey at the end of the webinar requesting your feedback on today's presentation. We kindly ask that you fill this out as your input helps us and Heyday going forward. That is all from me. I would now like to turn it over to our experts today for what I know will be a highly informative and engaging presentation. Kimberly and Amanda, take it away.
Well, thank you, Claire. Give me 1 second. I'll get my PowerPoint pulled up. A couple of housekeeping items right quick. The chat, if you use it, will certainly go to Kimberly and I, but not everybody else can see it. So as you have questions as we move forward, if you would put those in the Q&A box, that way everybody can see your question. And we will certainly get to those. We're happy as they're coming up. We'll try to get to them as we go, but we can also, if we don't catch everything, we can certainly do that to the end. And for those of you who don't know us, I do recognize a few names on here, so good to see some familiar names. But I am Amanda, and with me is Kimberly. So that's your two hats of the Heyday Services duo. So this is a 12 series webinar. Today we're going to cover BIL, or the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law Funding, to give you some background information, some resources and input on how to get moving with that. So we're going to go ahead and jump on in. And you will get a copy of these slides after the fact. GMA is going to share those with you. So just know that you will get a copy of these. Claire was kind enough to introduce us, but if you wanted to know a little bit more about Kimberly and our background and our experience, we certainly have this slide here to give you an idea of what we have been up to lately.
Hey, Amanda,
Yes.
I want to make sure that everybody can see the slides.
Good question. If you would don't mind put in the chat if you can see the slides, so we know, just to make sure that's.
I can't see the slides, so let's see. No,
Oh, you cannot.
Nope.
That's interesting because I am sharing. Let's try this again.
Here we go. This is looking super fun.
Now we can see the
Ta-da.
slides. So excellent. I'm glad you jumped in.
Happy to jump in and you know, yeah. And so we have folks in the Q&A. Thank you for using the Q&A to point out that you couldn't see the slides. But now someone said, Jessica Hicks said, there it is. So I'm not going to add the sound effect from the 90s that would have made that a complete song reference. Just imagine in your head, if you know, you know.
There we go. As we get going, we don't want to assume that everybody knows everything, because there's a lot of things about grants, and heck, we still don't know every single little nuance. So a quick overview of what federal grant funding is. There's a couple of different options here. So first of all, we have competitive grant funding, which is what most people think of when they think of grants. This is when a funder is going to release a program and an application. You're going to work on that application. You're going to hit submit by the deadline, and it's going to be a competitive process, meaning there's going to be reviewers that look over it, and those whose projects and programs score the highest, they're the ones that are going to get funded. The rest will get that lovely thank you for applying, but you didn't get selected letter, right? So that is that competitive process. So that is one portion of federal grant funding. But we also have formula grant funding. Some people also call this mandatory funding. But what it is it truly is a formula that determines who is getting money. A lot of money comes to state agencies this way. The federal government will create programs, and it'll be divvied out amongst the states, and it may be by a formula because it's based on population. It could be, if it's for transportation, it may be based on the number of lane miles of interstates we have within our state. In the same way, it could work for local governments as well. When you work for a city, you could potentially formula-based funded grants. A good example of this you may have heard of before is the Justice Assistance Grant, or JAG grant, that you police departments and sheriff's office and court systems get money based on your population and your last 3 years worth of Part 1 crime data. So the bigger your city, the more Part 1 crimes, and Part 1s are the nastiest of the crimes, right? It's going to be murder and things like that. They're going to give you more money because they figure you need more assistance to be able to deal with those issues within your community. So it's, you know, I had one time, we used to get, where I used to work, we used to get the JAG grant every year. We'd get about anywhere between $10,000 and $15,000. And one year we didn't get the grant. And my police chief immediately was like, did we forget to turn something in? Was it a bad project we submitted? Like, why didn't we get the grant this year? The answer is it was a formula grant, and our crime numbers had actually gone down so much that we were no longer eligible for that formula grant. We didn't have enough crime to be able to get it, which, yeah, we didn't get a grant. That's a good problem to have, though, right? So you just want to know that, because if someone's like, hey, I've heard about this grant, why aren't we getting it? If it's a formula-based grant, there's, you either meet the formula or you don't, okay? Another example of a grant is a continuation grant. Some funders will give you a year's worth of funding, and it may be one of those things, as long as you are submitting your grants on time and you were doing a good job with the program, it may be eligible for additional years worth of funding. So you're not having to go out through the initial competitive application again. You just may have to turn in something, usually it's something smaller as far as an application goes, to be able to continue that grant into year 2 or year 3 and moving forward. Okay, so that's an application you may have to work on. And then another grant terminology you may have heard of before is pass through. Okay, so this is when the federal government has a grant, they award the grant to somebody, whether it's a state agency or it could be a larger city or something like that. And then that agency can then pass it through to other agencies. When I worked in cities in Georgia, I got a lot of federal grant funding, but most of it was pass through. Yes, occasionally I would go straight to the feds and get funding from them, but more often than not, the federal government would give grant money to different state agencies in Georgia, and then I would apply there, right? So you could potentially be getting money from the Georgia Department of Transportation or the Georgia Emergency Management Agency. It may still be federal funding. They're just taking it, they'll use a portion of it for their own needs, and then the rest they're passing through usually a competitive type process where you're applying for. And it's important to know that, because even though you may think, oh, this is state money because the state's giving it to me, it could be federal money that goes to the state and then goes to you. And you need to know that, because when it comes to grant management, which we'll talk about in a later webinar, federal grant dollars have a whole lot more rules and regulations than any other. So you want to make sure that you understand that, yes, it's a grant I got from the state, but really it's federal money that passed through them and then came to me. So kind of in a nutshell, a couple of different ways you can receive federal grant funding. Okay, so the real reason we're here today is to talk about the bipartisan infrastructure law. So a quick overview. Back in November of 2021, President Biden signed this into law. The law was actually named the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or IIJA. And it's kind of been nicknamed the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or bill. That rolls off your tongue a little bit better than IIJA, right? And it was about $1 trillion that is being pushed out, some through programs that already exist, and some through new programs. If anybody was around back in like 2008, 2009, when we had the stimulus money, think about, all of a sudden there was a big influx of grant programs. That's another example of a time when suddenly there was. But I will tell you, $1 trillion, a whole lot bigger than anything we've seen, at least in my last 20 years of memory of in the grant world. And so that's what we're going to talk about today, is the bipartisan infrastructure law. I'm going to turn it over to Kimberly here.
Always want to check and make sure Mr. Mute is on, because I hate to be that person.
Oops, I didn't mean to stop my
So
share.
while Amanda's gonna come
One
back
sec.
with the
There we are.
slides, I just wanted to take a minute and once again, thank everyone for being here today, and thank all our partners, and we're just real excited about this. We are ready to go.
There, I can hear you now. There you are.
There we are. Did I freeze?
You just blacked out for a minute, but you're back. So let's keep on.
Well, time, space, continuum things are a plague for me, time travel, whatever. I'm kidding, y'all. Thanks for putting up with tech. Really, there's some storms rolling through today, so let's all move forward together, and that's what the Q&A is for, to let us know your questions and to let us know what's happening. So again, if it didn't come through during my brief phase and when I was teleporting, just wanted to thank GMA and thank all our partners that have come together to make this happen. Amanda and I are really passionate about making sure that there's always good, solid sound information, but also it doesn't have to be dry, dull, and boring. So we're here on a multi-part mission to help you through that. Also, a brief confession introducing this slide. I am obsessed with weather radar on apps, like an 85-year-old man who is retired and sits in his yard and yells at clouds. I love looking at those apps online. I love maps. And we wanted to provide you with some tools. And we're also going to go through briefly some wonderful tools at your disposal through GMA. So don't despair, we're going to get there as well. This can also be useful if you're trying to talk to folks who you might report to and you're trying to walk them through BIL funding, right? So you can go, because again, loving those maps, if you are a visually oriented person, you might enjoy going to the GSA.gov. It's their D2D project data to dashboard. And so they've got a map here. This is what you're seeing on your screen. They update it once a month. And as of today, they hadn't yet updated it to include some more data. But what we're going with here is nationwide. And what you can't see are the territories and Alaska and Hawaii. So it includes all of the US. And what you're seeing here is just a snapshot. If you were to add up all these numbers, it wouldn't add up to 1 trillion. And if you look to the left where it says Georgia 6.7 billion, you might be like, wait, it's supposed to be more than that. We got you covered. That's what's being represented by GSA is sort of being in play right now. They're reporting on grants distributed and the value of current grants open as of, in this case, July 7th, 2023. So again, you're going to get the slides, you're going to get all sorts of resources with this, so you don't have to take pictures of the screen unless you want to. You'll have this information for reference. So we'll probably just ease on down to the next slide. So again, you'll see that we wanted to point out the BIL funding at a glance for Georgia. So we've got 2 different data sets, if you will, 2 different sources here, right? On the left, GMA, which you can find right on their website, updated regularly, fabulous, fabulous resource. There's no way we can go over everything in an hour, but we're going to give you an overview and give you some follow-up pointers. So you'll already see that if you think back to the previous slide, and we don't need to go there, that number 6.7 billion is dwarfed by all the dollars that are listed here. That's because the thing on the slide previously was sort of a snapshot. This is your overview from GMA. Then if you look to the right of your slide, again, if you love a good weather map or just maps in general, you're in good company. You can drill down on the D2D GSA site, and you've got your URL there to look and see how the money is being distributed so far and what's open so far in Georgia. And you'll see, as Amanda referred to earlier, they have it divided up by discretionary, which is another way of saying those competitive grants, right? And then formula, which she described previously. So just throw it in a pro tip. Again, if you're wanting to see, this is a great way to think about, where do I want to collaborate? Would it make sense? Could there be some strength in numbers if we want to move forward with some other infrastructure projects, right? If you go in on the D2D map from GSA, if you hover over any of those dots, it'll pop up some information about where that grant is and who that grant is going to that could help guide your search. Again, if you've been doing this for a while now, you may be like, oh, ho hum, I already know this. This could be a chance to drive some collaborative efforts, again, with maybe a smaller municipality or a group of municipalities in a particular area to really hone in on some big ticket BIL funding items that could just benefit tons and tons of people across a region. So just giving you some information. And so we'll move on to the next slide.
Well, and I'd say too, Kimberly, because I've played around on this map, you can really zoom in. And so you can even drill down and to see county by county level, which could be really helpful to see. And they don't tell you who the recipient of the grant award was, but they give you the name of the project. And so if you're clued in enough to your community, you could do some best guesses of, oh, I bet this was the city of so-and-so, or I bet they would know who it is, to be able to, if you want to, like, I pick up the phone and say, hey, I saw you got a grant through BIL. I'm doing my first one. Can you share some tips and tricks? I'm happy to pick you to a cup of coffee in exchange or whatever, and take advantage of their knowledge, because these are the ones that they have won the grant award already.
So next up, we just wanted to once again give GMA a quick shout out for the great job that they're doing to make sure you have the tools and resources. Again, just a quick screenshot, because I know that their website is chock full of all kinds of information, but this, I love this, the 4 seasons of grants. And this is not just BIL, but it certainly includes BIL, and is a quick reference point that is updated. You can click in by quarter, as you'll see there, or you can also download the PDF the big old pro tip over there is that GMA updates this weekly. And because they do, if you know how this works, if you download the PDF and think, I've got all the grants for all time, yeah, no, it's going to change. So you'll need to go back and get that. And also you may, and this has happened to me so many times, whether it's with a client or an employer, where I find this perfect grant, right? It's everything. It's everything we want to do. The amount is right, the scope is right, and then it like closed 2 days ago because that happens. I would say you can use this also as a planning tool. If you're looking at all 4 seasons of grants, right? And it could be BIL is going to be in play, goodness, I think until at least 2028. Some programs 2026 because there's so many federal agencies involved and states and local governments. It's going to, your mileage is going to vary, but there are years in play here, and certain of these grants, maybe Department of Energy, for example, will come up again. So that if you see these grant opportunities that look great, but either you're just not ready yet, it's due in 5 days, and you have no idea how to even spell Justice 40, which we'll be talking about in a second, then you can use this as a planning tool. Again, great tools from GMA, and we will move on into.
And I'd say too, like they're doing the research for you, which is amazing. And they're pulling out all the other stuff that cities aren't eligible for. So they're saving you so much time by having this. So if you're not reading it.
So
Yeah.
I mentioned Justice 40 just a second ago. What we, as you might imagine, BIL, and we're going to have a list of the different agencies and examples of projects later on, and it's mind-boggling, right? And it can feel overwhelming. I believe that this money can transform communities, and I'm pretty sure you do too, otherwise you wouldn't be here. But if you think about what's a way to sort of get this all around, and we're getting back to my mild obsession with maps and stuff, we decided to think of it as a journey, and using the Justice 40, which is an integral part of BIL, and along with the American Rescue Plan and IRA and all sorts of related big federal packages. Justice 40, we want to talk to you about that and hear your questions about that as sort of the lens to view how to pull
Well, let's hope.
scale proposals together.
There you are. You're back.
Yeah, gosh, I'm sorry. I'm not getting any notifications. Should I just repeat again, Justice 40?
Yes.
To talk about that. I really apologize. Not getting any notifications about anything going on my end. So I'm sorry, but let me repeat briefly. Yeah.
Go for it.
Okay. So we're talking about Justice 40 as the lens to view all of this different kind of funding across BIL, because it is a requirement. So let's sort of use that as our GPS tool to kind of navigate on your BIL journey. And we'll just go to the next slide and we'll get into some more details about it. So just as a start, it's an executive order as opposed to BIL itself, right? Justice 40 is an executive order, which means it was something the president put into play, and it wasn't a full-fledged part of the law that came through, but they're working together, right? So Justice 40 is the overlay for BIL funding, and it represents, at least in my experience, it represents a departure from traditional ways that you may have worked with defining your service area. So Justice 40 is the nickname for Executive Order 14008. It's 40% of the original benefits of certain federal investments, i.e. the BIL, for one, must demonstrably go toward disadvantaged communities. And this is language that is from the executive order, and they're defining disadvantaged communities as marginalized, underserved, and overburdened by pollution. So that is sort of the list. So 40% of whatever your project is must demonstrably benefit these populations. So what we're going to do next is sort of go through some tools and some more information about this. And what I'll do if I feel like this temporary blackout for me might happen again, I'll just turn my camera off for a minute. And sometimes that may, you know, help the processing. But for now, let's go on to the next slide.
We do have a question too, a question about what is considered resilient infrastructure.
So resilient infrastructure is going to be defined very specifically in the RFP or the official funding announcement or the NOFO for each of these grants. An overview, and again, your mileage is going to vary. Always, always. I can give you an overview answer, and Amanda can too, but you always want to go to the grant itself for their, in case they're putting their own spin from that particular agency. Resilient infrastructure can be defined as things that are going to promote some sort of sustainable benefit in the community they serve. And I know that's not very specific, but it really depends on what aspect of infrastructure that you're talking about and what agency that grant is going to. So I hope that that at least gives you a starting point to explore that as it relates to your specific funding.
Well, and it talks too about that it's, you know, the purpose of resilient infrastructure being supporting communities through capacity building, encouraging and enabling innovation and partnership. And so you really need to think beyond like, hey, we just need to widen this road. Start thinking of, well, why do we need to widen it? Is it because we need to, maybe we're offering some transit stops and maybe we're partnering with some local nonprofits who provide services along the route, and they may be telling you that our residents also need X, Y, and Z. So it's beyond just like building a road. You're really kind of looking at what's the purpose, what's the need, how is that going to help beyond just cars getting to and from? That makes sense.
So again, that's tying into the Justice 40 concept, right? That 40% of these populations. A couple of notes here, quick here, Amanda. Someone said it's actually that you're freezing and not me. So you know what? Again, we're just asking y'all's patience and understanding as we figure this out, because this is a little unusual.
Yeah.
We had another question about the tool, the mapping tool, and why does it use the year of census data that it uses? And we're actually going to be answering that question live, but thank you for putting it in there. And so why don't we go to the next slide?
Yes. So one of the requirements of Justice 40 is that everybody has to engage in stakeholder consultation. So again, going back to thinking about, you know, as a city, you may have decided, hey, we really need new water lines, or we need this road or this infrastructure, but you don't get to just decide that on your own. They really want you to be able to talk to the community, talk to the residents you're serving, the people who are using your facilities, and getting their input as part of the process. Now, what's interesting is that even though they tell you you're required to do this, they don't really tell you how it has to be done. Okay, so right now they're kind of leaving it up to you. So you really need to think about what are ways that we can engage our stakeholders. Now, I will say, I think for the most part, city governments do a pretty good job of this anyway, where, you know, we're pretty used to having public informational meetings, to, you know, surveying our citizens, to, you know, encouraging people to come to council meetings and talk about these sorts of things. So, you know, there's nothing wrong with continuing and doing these sorts of things, but you definitely want to make sure that you're documenting whatever processes you're using. So if someone comes back later and says, hey, how did you do stakeholder consultation? You can go back and be able to say, well, we advertised these meetings this way. We had this many people sign up. Here or show up. Here's our sign up sheet. You know, we put this thing in the paper, we did X, Y, and Z, and that's how we engaged our stakeholders. So again, there's no real like, this is how you do it, but you've got to be able to show that you've involved them in some way. a couple of tools and resources for you, and this is one of the ones that was mentioned in the Q&A. The first is the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool. And one of the handouts we're sending your way is a list of a bunch of resources, which includes a link directly to this website. So if you haven't been on there yet, you've got that. And it is basically kind of like a GIS map tool where you can help determine where those disadvantaged communities are, the ones that are marginalized and underserved and overburdened by population. So it looks, if you've ever played around with census data before, it very much models the way things are set up with census tracts and things like that. And so you can go in there and say, okay, I've got a project that is going to serve this area, and you can basically, you know, select, you know, is it the entire county that you're serving? Is it just your city limits? Is it just a neighborhood within your city? But you can kind of select where that is. And this tool will be able to show you if at least 40% of the beneficiaries of this project are going to, you know, meet this requirement so that you meet that 40% minimum of serving disadvantaged communities. So it's a really helpful tool for you to be able to figure that out. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about how some folks have used it, but go ahead, Kimberly.
I wanted to make sure in our Q&A, the follow-up question to that was, and I know this will go into one of your stories about
Yes.
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 You have to use the CEJST. This is a please don't kill the messenger moment. Hello, hi. But it's like, that's the tool that they want you to use versus other sources for Justice 40. So
yeah.
I have thoughts and feelings about that. Yeppers, but
yeah.
that's the name of the game. So
yeah. And the frustration here is that they are using 2010 census data when they created this tool. So why they did that, somebody at some point decided that was the most complete data they were going to use when they were building the tool. You know, there really is no better answer as to why they're not using 2020 census data. So you may know, like, hey, this census tract meets that requirement, but you go and use the tool and it doesn't show that because maybe some things have changed in the past 10 years. And that can be really frustrating if you're like, I really am trying to serve the current needs of my current constituents, but you have to use that tool like Kimberly says, and it is using 2010 data, which means that it really isn't the most up to date. So that's the tool that you have to use to be able to prove you're meeting that 40% service model. Okay, so there's that tool. And the other is the Interim Justice Implementation Guide. They haven't updated it since July of 2021. I just checked last week, and that's still the most recent guided information. But it's through the Office of Management and Budget, or OMB. And they basically are spelling out how you are supposed to involve your constituents, but they really don't give you any details other than saying you're supposed to have stakeholder stuff going on. So it's worth reading, and it may spark some ideas for you, but it is not a guideline. They haven't created yet, like, this is how we want you to do it. So it's kind of open to interpretation. So again, I go back to figure out what works for your community, document the heck out of it. And if you have questions and concerns too, you can always call your funder. Like, if you already know this is the grant I'm applying for, I'm working on this stuff, there's going to be a contact for what that grant program in the guidelines, or the RFP, the request for proposals, or the NOFA, or however the acronym they like to call it for your grant guidelines. There is going to be either a person's name and their phone number and email, or there might be just a generic like info at. Feel free to email and say, hey, this is how we're doing our stakeholder engagement. This is how we're documenting it. Do you have any better suggestions? And they may, or they may just say, no, that works. Okay. And so don't be afraid to ask your funder if you want to make sure you're following things through the correct way, even before you get the grant award. That's what they're there for. So I want to be able to share with you a couple of examples of how this is working in the real world. So I've talked to a couple of different people who have written grants, have dealt with some of these different tools, and some of the advice and information that they have shared with me. So the first individual I talked to works for a county organization, and they were working on a transportation study applications. So they were wanting to study some areas within the community where there had been an increase or a large number of accidents, injuries, and fatalities on the roadways within the county. So they could study those intersections and those stretches of road where all these things were happening to come up with a plan to create, then eventually do, hopefully through grant funding, some infrastructure projects to increase the safety of the roadways. Okay. And so for them, because they were doing, it wasn't just like my project right here. We looked at the county as a whole. And so they were doing projects all over. They were able to go in on that mapping tool and start laying in, okay, we're going to be able to service this swath of an area and this swath of an area, and just start laying them all out. And as they plug them in to see that, yep, they were, are we hitting that 40% or more or not? Because if they weren't, they could take out a project area and maybe the 40, maybe that number would go up, or they could add another area, in another part of the county where they knew there were some areas that would fit those marginalized community type requirements there. Okay, so they knew where the projects needed to happen. They plugged all of that in, and if needed, tweaked a little things to make sure they met that 40%. And this individual told me it was super easy, that he thought the mapping tool was an easy thing to use. It was pretty clear cut. His complaint was the 2010 data as well, because he was like, I knew some things weren't quite accurate, but I finally realized that. And once I did, I thought, okay, I'm just going to go with it, because that's what they want me to do. So that was his, as far as working with the Justice 40 in the map, that was his advice and experience. Now, as far as submitting the grant application, he, just if you've ever submitted a grant through grants.gov before, the BIL grants are no different really than any other grant that you have probably submitted through that portal, right? The portals, sometimes it's great, sometimes it's not. There were certainly limitations to how much information you could provide, which can be frustrating when you're like, I have so much to say, but I only have 200 words to answer this section, or I only have so many pages. So that was that person's experience. I spoke with another individual who works for a large county in South Florida, who they were really focused on talking about that, the infrastructure, the resilient infrastructure. And so one of the things he was talking about was even though everybody he was working with was in the same organization, they all worked for the same county. Their county is so big and they have so much money and so many projects. He talked about he had a really hard time of getting everybody on the same page for a project, like working with people who were doing, because they were doing some big road infrastructure projects. But he was like, I was having to deal with our transportation people. I was having to deal with our transit people, having to deal with our housing people, because we're trying to make sure that if we're building roadways and we're helping with transit infrastructure, that we really truly are connecting affordable housing to jobs and to this and to that. And he said, even within my own county, getting everybody to come together and to determine what was the best project and where, based on all of those needs, took a lot of planning ahead of time. And so it was one of those things where he was like, you can't wait till the grant application came out and said, okay, because by then you're already almost behind the 8 ball figuring out even what your project is. So that was his advice, was if you've got a lot of people involved, even within your own agency, start communicating now. Like if you know, hey, there's this grant coming, but it's not out yet, and it's going to be out in a couple of months. Don't wait, start doing your planning now. The last individual I talked with was actually doing a project for a university. And for her, she said the mapping tool was difficult because, unlike, for us that work in cities and counties, you kind of know, like, your project's going to be within the borders of your city or county. I mean, you may partner with somebody else and it may be within their borders too, but still you have a very good geographical idea of where this was happening. For her, working at a university, the people that she's serving are students that could live anywhere in the country. And so she said it was really hard to be able to figure out, how can I map out all the people that I'm helping that are living all of these different places, but the work's actually happening here in this one place. Because I couldn't, just where the college was didn't meet that requirement of the Justice 40. So she was having to figure out how to map out the students they were serving, where they were living, did they come from those marginalized communities? And so she said it was a lot more difficult than if it was just, hey, this is my geographic unit. So that tool seems great, unless you're doing something like that, which I don't think is probably going to happen here. I mean, you could be partnering with the university and doing something similar to that. So just a couple of things of note to mention. So when you think about like, hey, this is going to be like every other grant I've ever written before, and it's going to be easy peasy. There are tools, and sometimes they work great, and sometimes not so much. So you just really might have to play with it. One other gentleman I talked to that worked for a city, he said that tool actually kind of drove what projects, like he's like, we had a whole list of projects we wanted to get done. But he's like, we quickly discovered we had a handful of projects that were right in the center of some of those areas that were mapped through the Justice 40. And so he's like, we were able to say 100% of the people we're serving through this project meet those Justice 40 requirements. So they were way over the percentage. And then he has gotten some of his programs funded already. And I'm sure that's part of it, to be able to say like 100% of the people we're serving meet the Justice 40 requirements, instead of just, I'm not saying just 40, there's nothing wrong with that, but that was a helpful thing. So if you've got multiple projects that are eligible for the different types of grant funding programs, you may want to use that tool to figure out, hey, where are some of the ones that really do fit these requirements? And let's go for these projects over some of these others. So you could kind of prioritize based on what meets the Justice 40 lens, if that makes sense.
Also, Amanda, I've just got to
Yes.
say, I don't think anyone's ever used easy peasy to describe applying for federal funding, but good for you if that's your experience. You know, yay.
True story. It's never easy peasy, but some are easier than most. Let's put it that way.
And we just feel really strongly going through this training, and then we'll hop into all these details in these slides. But we feel really strongly that offering that anecdotal information and people's personal experiences and business experiences with this process are what will bring value to these discussions, which is why we really want to spend that kind of time and tailor it and get feedback from folks and share that with you to enrich this training experience. And while I'm going through different aspects of this very huge the BIL project in front of us, I wanted to make sure that you all knew that if you had questions, you can put them in the Q&A. You get to the Q&A by going to the bottom of your screen and your Zoom screen rather, and hitting the Q&A button down there, and it pops up and you can chime in. There have been a couple of folks who've said, hey, the chat is disabled. And what we're trying to do here is to make sure that the questions are seen and answered, as opposed to maybe sometimes getting lost in the chat. So it was a deliberate choice by GMA to make sure that your questions are heard and understood. But right now, we don't have any questions. So if you do have questions about BIL, please, this is your chance to do that. Obviously this will be recorded. The slides can be used as a reference, but the advantage of attending something live like this is that you can get your questions answered. The other quick note that I wanted to make, and Amanda, jump in on this too, I want to make sure that people understand how they can find out. We already talked about some resources, and you're going to get handouts of tools and resources for more information, but it could feel overwhelming, right? Particularly if you've got all sorts of infrastructure needs, or you've got EPA sites that you want to clean up, you've got all kinds of things going on. How can you find out about all of this in advance enough so that you're not, scurrying around like crazy trying to put something together? So again, I would direct you to GMA's site. We talked about there are 4 seasons of grants that includes BIL information. But also, as we go through some of these project major categories, if you're like, oh, that's for me, or oh, we're interested in that, then I would advise you to also, yes, you can go to grants.gov and search, but once you narrow it down to the big federal agency, and the agency and the departments and offices underneath that are sponsoring that, go there and make that bookmark that site. If they do have a BIL or other grant related newsletter, e-newsletter, sign up for that. I like multiple ways to find out what's going on. Amanda, is there, besides the
Yeah.
Federal Register, is there anything else you would add?
Well, there is, and I can't remember who put it out, but there is a huge PDF document that breaks down all of this information we're about to, that's where we got the information from for the next couple of slides. And it's actually the last resource on the resource document we're giving you. We give you a link to the entire PDF, but I'm not kidding when I say it's hundreds of pages long. And we've bookmarked all the different categories. So you can go and check out transportation, and underneath there, you can see more about, roads, bridges, and major projects, 400 billion, but then they'll break down the exact funding category. So you can go there and you're getting the names of the actual programs. So once you know that, then you can search on grants.gov for it, or you can just even do a Google search, U.S. Department of Transportation, such and such program, and it's probably going to take you to the right page on their website. So that'll be a handy tool to have if you haven't played around with that yet.
So we're giving you several different ways to do this. And again, not to overwhelm you with information, but to empower you with information so that, just speaking from my own professional experience in this, the idea that there's a pop-up last minute thing, it's super stressful. And a lot of times the agency may be eligible, but not competitive for the grant, and BIL grants are competitive by nature. And so I would say as far ahead as you can get of when announcements are going to come out, or even just understanding which agency and department and office would be the best fit for maybe your top 3 projects. It's worth the time to go through this documentation and just get your game plan together. And yeah, I'm going back to the whole map and GPS thing. It's just so much more helpful to know where you're going and to have sort of that roadmap laid out, but also know that there may be multiple ways to get that specific information. So with that in mind, I'm going to go through, and in the interest of time, I want to go through the slides. And again, let's think about these, please, as like reference guides to spark some, oh wait, we didn't think about that. We didn't think about that. Something that'll come up later on in the slides, they're huge. There's all sorts of funding opportunities out of the Department of Energy. But one that really grabbed my attention the other day, I mean, talk about drilling down. I think it closed August the 3rd. So it's, it would be archived by now in grants.gov, but it was energy efficiency for nonprofits in certain areas. And so like getting their facilities through BIL, getting the facilities energy efficient so that they their bills go down and they don't have to raise as much money just to pay the light bill or the water bill or what have you. And I mean, we all know how energy efficiency works, but yeah, that was a really specific grant that could have a major impact in your community if there's a group or a large scale community center or other group that's a mainstay of your city's sort of social services safety net. So I'm just using that as an example that there's some very specific things that may not jump immediately to the top of mind when you're looking at infrastructure. So again, I just want to make sure that we had a quick review of all the different ways you can find out this information. So again, Department of Transportation, if we're sort of choosing our destination of where we want to go with BIL funding, keeping in mind the Justice 40 sort of overview that must be a part of everything. And again, this is nationwide. We already discussed the tools where you can find out what's going on in Georgia, but just here, there's an enormous breadth and depth. And some of the waterways projects, you'll also find sort of sister funding in the EPA when it comes to like clean water and infrastructure and environmental cleanup. So we're just going to go through each of these here. And as you can see, all sorts of transportation everywhere. and I was doing a review of recent awards, and as we move into the climate, energy, and environment, I want to just say right quick that there was a recent awards announcement that was around public transportation. And I was like, okay, who got this? And one of the award cities was Chicago. I'm like, makes sense, huge public transportation. But then it was the Cherokee tribe, now based out of Oklahoma, also won a public transportation award under BIL to shore up public transportation to medical appointments and hospital visits. So again, you might not think of or you might be thinking of public transportation as, well, our city, we don't really have that. That's not really where we are, but you may have another kind of transportation issue or something very specific for those communities that are described as disadvantaged. So I just wanted to throw that out there, as these things are both far more general than I ever imagined before BIL really came out, but also offer some very specific, really granular kind of funding opportunities that could be of help. Again, we were talking about clean energy and power. The example of, and it was nonprofits, energy efficiency, go for this grant. I mean, there are all sorts of other stipulations, but that came under energy efficiency and retrofits for homes, buildings, and communities, which you can see on your screen was $6.5 billion. But they're cutting that funding some interesting ways. And by cutting, I mean slicing and dicing into smaller pots of money, not eliminating it. So just some examples here of different ways to get into that. And also the final one I want to point out on this slide is the funding. It's the last bullet point, the funding for clean energy manufacturing and workforce development. There could be wonderful ways to tie that into your municipality's economic development funding and attracting new businesses. And I know that I'm preaching to the choir. I fully understand that, but there are probably some folks back in your offices that you might need to convince about this or educate about this. So that workforce development could have all sorts of implications for really diving into that justice 40% of a disadvantaged population being served by that. So if we go on to the next slide, water, I mentioned water earlier as crossing over a couple of different federal agencies at least. And these are some more specific things that may or may not apply to you. The third bullet down, the PFAS, that's an acronym that I am not even going to begin to tell you that I remember exactly. But what I can tell you is it's contaminants in the certain chemicals that don't disperse or hang around for a long time in the air and in the water and in the ground. And it's there's a huge $10 billion grant program infrastructure associated with just that. So again, enormous opportunities, but lots of research to do, finding the things that fit right for you.
Yeah. Kimberly, we've got a question about, will there be any opportunities for schools and daycares to directly apply for the lead service line replacements or testing?
That's a really good question. I haven't heard of any yet, but this is such a huge program that I would recommend following with, it's going to be Housing and Urban Development and EPA. Amanda, am I missing another big federal agency? What I'm suggesting is that drill down. Wherever you've received or other people have received money before for lead abatement, also, it may not come directly to you. It may be a pass-through. So all that to say, it remains to be seen.
Yeah, because I mean, Kimberly and I haven't read every single RFP. They're not all out yet, first of all, and that's all we would do if we read all of these. But the trick is to go in and looking and seeing who are the eligible recipients and what the eligible projects are. And so schools and daycares may be eligible recipients, but if you're not, then what I would do if I worked there, I would be looking, going, who is an eligible recipient? And if it's local governments, I would be going and meeting who owns those water lines, right? Are they is it the county? Is it a separate water authority? I'd be going to them going, hey, we found this grant opportunity. It would solve a problem that probably we both have. You're eligible, I'm not. Let's talk about a joint application together with you as the lead, as the eligible applicant. So the trick is figuring out who's eligible to apply, what are the eligible projects exactly, and if you can either fit it yourself or find someone who does and partner with is the way to go to make that happen.
And it could be because the one I mentioned, the energy efficiency, nonprofits could apply directly. So I wish I could wave a magic wand and go, I know it's going to drop on the next Tuesday of a month without an R in it, but I don't know that, but it is a really good question. I would just say, make this a part of just checking in and being conversant. I know we're just about out of time, so let's move on to the next couple. We'll go through these slides again. Use these as reference to spark conversations. And also keep in mind, you could use Justice 40. You have your big list, I'm sure, of projects that need attention, the communities that need help, people need services. Maybe use the Justice 40 and the CJES tool, imperfect though it may be, it is the tool they want you to use, to go in and let that drive which things you apply for, if that makes sense, right? It's like, oh wait, we have this huge community that needs public transport or wastewater management. That may be our priority where we go because we can fit the Justice 40 criteria so well here and get this project taken care of. So we'll just go to the last couple of slides and please drop your questions in the Q&A. And we'll also be having later on a webinar that is specifically around research tips for all kinds of federal and state grants. So that's going to be a part of this too, because an hour is just not enough for all of this. So Amanda, if you want to go ahead and go to the next couple of slides, we'll just go on to the final slide again. Broadband, environmental projects, so many things. If you're interested, I will point out, if your municipality is in a rural area and you're interested in broadband, $2 billion at the Department of Agriculture. And that may not have been your agency of choice to think of research, but for broadband. But again, hoping that some of these things just spark some, let's go and investigate so that you can find the right fit. I think the temptation could be, we need everything, we want everything, we're going to apply for everything. That's just probably not going to be realistic for a lot of different reasons. Resource management, sleep, a life, narrowing down the opportunities that are right for you, using Justice 40 to help maybe drive your priorities, because that is the requirement, and the CJES tool is the mapping tool that you must use, can really go a long way to helping you sort of tackle the huge behemoth that is BIL and where your municipality's place is best served within it.
Yeah. So we've got about a minute left, and I know Claire's got to wrap up, but if you have any other questions, certainly put them in the chat. They gave you the link for the slides in the resource guide that we provided, which is all kinds of tools and resources. Don't feel like you have to read all of it, but play around, figure out what's going to be most helpful to you. We will certainly see you again in a couple of weeks. But if something sparks a question along the way, this is where you can find Kimberly and I, our email and our website. So we are happy if we can help point you in the right direction or answer a quick question. We are certainly happy to do that for you. So I will end our slideshow and turn it over to Claire.
Let me share my screen just briefly. I know we're running out of time. All right. Thank you so much, Amanda and Kimberly, for providing this expert overview of the bipartisan infrastructure law as it relates to Georgia. You both covered a great deal in a short amount of time, and we really appreciate you both for bringing your expertise to our members today. To those on the call, we hope you'll bring this information back to your respective communities and turn it into action. I will be in touch soon with a follow-up email, and we always encourage anyone to reach out to GMA with questions or comments on how we can better serve you and your city when it comes to grants. On the screen, I've showed a schedule of the upcoming sessions, and you can register at the link in the chat. Our next session is 2 weeks from today, same time, same place, Thursday, August 24th. I do appreciate everyone for being patient with me as we try and iron out some of the technical mishaps that we had today, but I assure you that we will be back next time with everything smoothened out. So again, thank you everyone for being on. Thank you, Amanda, Kimberly, Laura, and our team here at GMA for helping pull off this webinar. And we hope to see everyone 2 weeks from today. Take care. Bye.